Welcome back to English 232, American Literature 2. Before we get started on this week's activities that I just want to kind of give an overview for, I'm going to try to keep this video as short as possible because I know you got stuff to do and you're busy. I wanted to thank you for playing along in the very first discussion board, that kind of cheesy icebreaker set of questions. I appreciate you kind of humoring the old guy on the other side of the internet that's talking at you instead of talking with you, which hopefully we'll be doing in class sooner rather than later. I'll let y'all know when I hear about getting this hybrid section back onto a hybrid format. Can't come soon enough. Anyway, I also found out, it was great, in terms of the discussion board, it was great to find out some information about you guys and your interesting lives, and also to find out what good liars some of you are, because you fooled me completely, some of you. I'll keep that in mind when you're asking for deadlines and telling me all these stories about terrible things that are happening in your life. I'll know that you're a very good liar, but I'll still trust you probably. Speaking of lying, I lied to you once in the discussion board. If you looked at my example thread that I said, a couple of y'all responded to that. Let me quickly tell you, I am a huge fan of K-pop. Over this last year of being kind of quarantined with my teenage daughter especially, we've become big fans of K-pop. I'm a huge stan of the group Mamamoo and of one of their members, Hwasa, who's just brilliant, I think. Anyway, you should check them out. Check her out on YouTube. I also did meet Stan Lee. I'm, believe it or not, a huge comic book nerd. And when I was much, much younger, I met Stan Lee at a kind of lecture he was giving. This was before comic book conventions were a huge deal, and all the creators would just go there. Now, this was at a time when he was going on the lecture circuit, and a lot of times would go to college campuses to talk. So I got to meet him after his speech and got his autograph, which is in one of those books back on that bookshelf. So the thing I lied about was meeting my wife in fencing, on the fencing team in college, which actually I did. That actually did happen, but I lied, little white lie, on a couple of the details. When I first laid eyes on her, she did not actually have a sword in her hand, because that might have been scary. But so swordless but beautiful, and I fell for her like that. She did not fall for me like that. It took a lot longer. Surprise. And she's not a better fencer than me. I was always better. Don't tell her if you ever meet us in person. Anyway, enough of that. On to the important stuff, which is poetry. And I know some of you are like, oh, really? Not poetry. Why start a promising semester off with the thing I hate, right? It's not just to torture my English students with poetry. And I know some of y'all have probably had bad experiences with reading poetry in English classes in the past. And I think it's not because there's anything wrong with you as a student and a reader, and nothing wrong with the genre of poetry. I think it's what's wrong is what we do with it in most English classes. I don't think poetry is some kind of code or formula that has to be kind of like wrung out to gain meaning, right? To be decoded. And I don't think it's some specimen that we are supposed to investigate and figure out the rhyme scheme and the pattern of rhythm and the iambic pentameter and all that jazz. That can be useful in coming up with meaning, but I think that kind of just clutters up our response to poetry, which should just be a kind of collaboration between the poet and us, the readers, right? It should be a collaboration, a working together. They've done their part, right? They put the words on the page in a very specific way, right? Very carefully picking the exact words, the exact images, ending the lines in exactly the right way that they wanted to do. And then it's up for us to do our half of the job in creating meaning, right? And that's the part where we can end up with different understandings, right? This isn't a math equation. We shouldn't all read an Emily Dickinson poem and get to the last line and end up with the same answer, right? Poetry ain't math, thank God. Poetry is this kind of condensed form of expression, sometimes very complex form of expression, and it's our job, but also possibly our joy to figure out what the meaning is to us, right? And maybe some interpretations make more sense than others, but there's not just going to be one right answer to this. And I think we can find joy in poetry. We certainly did when we were kids, right? Like Dr. Seuss, amazing poet. Hop on Pop is one of the greatest lines of poetry ever written, right? There's a music to it, hop on pop, and there's a vivid action to it that my kids loved to act out when they were hopping on me at the end of the day. So thanks for that, Dr. Seuss. But if you think about it, every time you go to Spotify and listen to music, that's poetry, right? I mean, that poetry is at its best when it's spoken or it's sung. There's music even when it's still just on the page, not as alive as it is when we're listening to it with our ears. There's still a music there, and there's still emotion and imagery and theme, meaning there. We don't have to dissect it to get it, right? We just have to find a way that we as individual readers can connect to it. And that's all I'm asking us to do this week. The first thing I'm asking you to do is read a set of poems, 6 poems, that I picked because they all have something to do with America. They're all expressing a certain experience that the poet has had with America. The first 2 are old. One's from Walt Whitman, right? So that's like 1800s when America was just figuring itself out. Not that we're not still trying to figure ourselves out, obviously, and sometimes tragically. And it's called I Hear America Singing, right? A kind of celebration of the wide variety of Americans and the work we do. The other poem of the old poems is from the great Langston Hughes, I Too, which is a direct response to Walt Whitman's poem, saying, hey, there's other folks in America that have other experiences. I'm here too, right? And I have a voice, and I have experiences worth expressing in poetry. The other 4 are much more recent poems. They're from contemporary poets, kind of covering a wide range of questions about what it is to be American, and sometimes criticizing this thing that we are labeling as America. And basically, this journal, for the first homework, I'm basically just asking you to read through them and pick the one that resonates most with you, one that you feel some kind of connection with, either an intellectual or an emotional one, or just the kind of impulse of, yeah, like me too. I felt that way too. That's all I'm looking for. And then for you to write a little bit about that. Then the other poems I'm asking you to read, and it's fairly straightforward, right out of the beginning of our anthology. And it's the brilliant American poets Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And I'm not picking them to torture you at the beginning of the semester. I'm picking them because I think they're really important. and because they set up kind of the key difference that I see happening in literature, the key impulses of literature. One is expressed by Whitman, who is kind of doing literature at its most extroverted. He's looking out and trying to capture experiences and capturing all the things he sees in this new society he was walking around in, this new country that was trying to figure out how it was different than the countries in Europe, trying to come up with its own culture and its own forms of expression. And so he's holding a mirror up to society and saying, here's what's amazing, right? He was there to not only celebrate himself, right? Song of Myself is the name of the poem, but to also celebrate the song of America, and to celebrate what's unique and special about America. So it's this kind of outer, looking outwards, that literature has always done, right? To kind of capture, to give voice to society and culture and the different experiences. He wanted very publicly to write an epic, right? This kind of sweeping, big verbal hug of America. He loved himself some Walt Whitman. Most of all, he celebrated himself, but he also celebrated America and wanted to be kind of the public voice, the bard of America. And in some ways, he was really successful. He wrote this little book called Leaves of Grass that was published like in 1850. It was like 14 or 15 poems, a little slim volume of poetry, and then just went on the rest of his life for another, almost 4 decades of writing and rewriting that book, Leaves of Grass, adding poems to it, expanding poems, until it was this large book at the end that captured his whole life. He was writing the book of his life and also in some ways the book of America as he saw it. So that's the sweeping big epic of America. Dickinson, who's writing it basically the same time, captures the other kind of literary impulse, which is introversion, which is to look inward. If Whitman's about exploration, Dickinson's about meditation. She wants to think hard about the hard mysteries, the deepest mysteries, life and death and faith and love. Man, that's it. If she could figure that out, then her poetic life was successful, even though almost nobody knew she was writing poetry, right? Whitman wanted to be out in the public. He wanted to be the people's poet. Dickinson probably wanted to as well, and she did submit a few poems, and a handful were published during her life, usually without her name attached to it. But most of the writing she did, hundreds and hundreds of poems, were never published during her life. And she spent a lot of time up in her bedroom by herself writing. And the poems weren't discovered until after her death, when her family found them. And they were short and sometimes hard to understand, but they're always asking the hard questions and trying to come up with answers. She was just as rebellious as Whitman. Whitman would write about anything, sex and love and death and nature and work and the city, but also the outside world. Dickinson would write about all those things too, but in a much more compact way, but in just as rebellious a way. Whitman is considered the first great poet of free verse, of breaking the rules of rhyme scheme and metered lines and things like that. And sometimes we get really frustrated with Whitman because he writes these long, long lines and just kind of catalogs of things, and you just want him to kind of get to the point. Dickinson's much more controlled, even though she's still writing free verse, but they fit a very set pattern of both rhyme and line meter. But she's just as radical in the questions she's asking, and just as rebellious, because she was born and raised in a very religious household, but refused the answers that organized religion gives us. Right? Like, here's what happens after you die. Here's the way to lead a good life. This is how we should think about love. She could have taken her religion's answers. Someone has already worked out the hard questions for you. Here, just take them. They're here in this book. She was like, nah, I'm not gonna accept the easy answers. I'll figure it out for myself. Thank you very much. And that's what she spent her life doing. So I think, yeah, sometimes these poems can be frustrating, but they're worth our attention, and they're worth us working out the meaning of them for ourselves, and they're worth our frustration. That's okay to be frustrated with stuff. You'll be frustrated with me, and you'll be frustrated with this more times than I want to think about, but it's worth it. The discussion board, I'm basically, towards the end of the week, I'm basically just asking you to pick one of the poems that I have listed. One of the poems that Dickinson is thinking about death and what happens afterwards. Pick one that kind of works for you, and then I've got some questions for you to answer. Both of these poets, Whitman and Dickinson, are writing during the time where Romanticism is kind of the dominant thinking among artists, and particularly literary artists in America, about the middle part of the 1800s. And I'm not going to get into that right now, to Romanticism. I'll save that for next week. But just remember, it was kind of a reaction against the age of reason and kind of the rational thought, and also the kind of like the dominant religious thought that was important in America and in its beginnings. There was this idea of measuring out this great big land, right? Of like, let's figure out borders and longitude and latitude and all of these physical dimensions, and use our rational minds to do that and map out this world. And then there was an equally strong impulse to map out the spiritual world, right? Religion and religious organized faith was a huge part of America at its beginnings. It still is. But the Romantics wanted to kind of say there's things that are more important than our rational, logical minds, and in some ways more important than the answers that religion gives us. So Romanticism emphasized intuition and imagination, and above all else, the individual. That each individual person was the hero of their own story and didn't have to be defined by the social class they were born into, or their family, or the place they were born, or the faith that surrounded them. They were capable and in some ways should be inspired to be their own man and their own woman and find their own song to sing. And that's what Whitman and Dickinson, as different as they are, were both doing at the beginning of our exploration of American literature. And we'll see all of those impulses continue on the literary discussion that makes up this course and has made up American literature for the last 150 years. That's all I've got for right now. Good luck this week. If you've got any questions about anything, shoot me an email or a text on Teams, and we can certainly get together one-on-one during my office hours and just talk about stuff. literary stuff or whatever stuff you want. So work hard, be kind. I'll see you back here soon. Take care.